They spoke as though my fate was already sealed, as though I was too old, too fragile, too tired to resist. What they didn't realize is that I'd been preparing for this moment all along, and their betrayal would cost them everything.
"Your memory isn't what it used to be, Mom." The words came from my daughter, Sarah, delivered with the kind of clinical detachment she'd learned in nursing school 30 years ago. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look particularly concerned. She just looked tired. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft hum of the old Frigidaire in the corner, the same one Harold and I had bought when Sarah was still in diapers. My granddaughter Jessica sat at the oak table, her manicured fingers drumming against wood I'd polished every Sunday for 43 years. The afternoon light slanted through the gingham curtains, casting shadows across the linoleum. I'd mopped that very morning. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't even sigh. I simply stood there, my hands steady against the counter's edge, feeling the familiar coolness of the formica beneath my palms. My chest felt hollow, like a music box after the melody stops playing. In that silence, I realized something sharper than disappointment. They had planned this conversation, but what they couldn't foresee, these two who thought they held all the cards, was that some battles are won with patience, not protests. "Don't forget to like and subscribe to help this story reach more people," Jessica said finally, her voice smooth as custard, as if she were discussing weekend plans instead of my future. "We don't want this to get complicated." I turned my head slightly. The edges of her words were soft, but the intention was iron. "Sarah," I said, tasting how quiet my voice sounded in the space we'd shared for so many meals. "You've always preferred simple solutions." My daughter kept her gaze fixed on the refrigerator door, where 40 years of grandchildren's artwork still clung with fading magnets. There was a crayon drawing Jessica had made in second grade, a lopsided house with smoke curling from a too large chimney. Her jaw worked silently against the memory. "Mom," she said, "let's keep this reasonable. We've talked about the situation." There was a manila envelope half hidden beneath yesterday's newspaper, and a stack of grocery store circulars on the kitchen table. The envelope peeked out just enough for me to see the letterhead, Sunset Manor Assisted Living. I watched that logo the way you watch storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Inevitable, calculated, rehearsed. "What situation?" I asked, almost gently. "You know," Sarah replied, "the arrangement. Since Dad passed, since the fall last winter, it's time for better care. Professional care. We found a wonderful place." Jessica cut in with a small, apologetic smile. "Not an institution, Grandma. It's more like a community. Game nights, organized activities. You'd have your own apartment." My wedding ring caught the light as I gripped the counter edge tighter. White gold, worn thin after 56 years. Harold's initials were still visible on the inside, though barely. I steadied my breathing. "This is your decision," I said. "Together." Sarah nodded once, her nursing supervisor mask sliding firmly into place. The afternoon light carved new lines into her face that hadn't been there when she was 12 and asked me why Daddy had to work so many double shifts, or 25, and called crying because the baby wouldn't stop teething. Lines that come from choices, some you inherit, some you carve yourself. "What happens to my garden?" I asked. "What happens to my roses?" "Mrs. Patterson next door said she'd keep an eye on things," Jessica replied too quickly. "And Mom can sell the house. The market's really good right now." She turned to Sarah as if I'd become invisible. "Gary thinks we could list it by spring." "The house?" I said. "Your childhood home," Jessica replied. "It's too big for you now, Grandma. And maintaining it alone, it's not safe for someone your age." I looked at my daughter. She looked at the crayon drawing on the refrigerator. The words, "too big," don't hurt like a slap. They settle. They rearrange the furniture of your heart until everything feels foreign. They also divide time into before and after. Before my daughter scheduled my erasure, after I learned the choreography was already set to music. On the table beside the envelope, a yellow sticky note was pressed like a small flag of surrender. Appointment. Tuesday, 2 p.m. The kitchen clock showed 11:30. 3 hours and 30 minutes. It was efficient, I had to give them that. They'd scheduled my life to end with the same precision Sarah used for her patients' medication schedules. "Let's not decide everything today," I said. Jessica's smile tightened at the corners. "We already put down a deposit, Grandma. They're holding the apartment because Mom explained your medical history." She gestured vaguely toward my cane, toward the small bruise on my shin from where I'd bumped into the coffee table last week. "They can move you in as early as Thursday." "And the paperwork?" I asked. My voice stayed level, steady as the tick of Harold's old mantel clock in the living room. Jessica reached for the manila envelope, sliding it free with practiced care. "Just a few signatures," she said, tapping the corner. "Medical power of attorney, so we can make decisions quickly if you need help. And," she glanced at Sarah, "a deed transfer to simplify things, so the house sale can go smoothly without burdening you with the details." A deed transfer. The words sat in the air like smoke. I'd heard enough legal terms in my 78 years to recognize a polite eviction notice. Sarah shifted in her chair. "Mom, this is what's best. We've looked at the finances. The house is expensive to maintain, and emotionally, the word caught in her throat like a fishbone. It's not healthy. You're isolated here." Isolated. I thought of Mrs. Patterson's morning waves, of the mailman who always asked about my tomatoes, of the church ladies who still called to check on me. Maybe isolation was their word for independence, and independence was something they couldn't schedule or manage or transfer with a signature. The refrigerator hummed a little louder, as if the old appliance wanted to remind them it was still working, still keeping things fresh, still serving its purpose. The house breathed around us, floorboards creaking as the afternoon cooled, pipes settling into their familiar rhythms. This is what a home does when you've lived in it long enough. It becomes an extension of your pulse, your breathing, your memory. My daughter, who had taken her first steps on these very linoleum tiles, who had measured her height against the kitchen doorframe until she was 16, was now a woman with a laminated badge in her purse, and a daughter who looked at houses like stock portfolios. She believed in systems. She believed in signatures. She believed she'd found the form that could convert a mother into a manageable problem. "I'd like some tea," I said finally, "if you don't mind." Neither of them moved. So I did. I walked to the stove and let the simple act of filling the kettle become a small rebellion. The gas burner clicked to life with its familiar blue flame. I reached for my favorite mug, the one Harold had given me for our 25th anniversary, painted with tiny violets that had faded but never disappeared. From the doorway, Sarah hovered. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We just..." Her throat worked against words she couldn't quite say. At least that was human. We have to think practically. It's what families do. Families do 1,000 things. They plant gardens together. They sit on porches counting fireflies. They hold hands through difficult diagnoses and celebrate small victories with homemade cake. They also, apparently, schedule appointments to erase the woman who taught them how to tie their shoes. "Practical," I said, letting the words settle. "Of course. We'll give you a few minutes," Jessica called from the kitchen. "Then we can go through everything together. The appointment is confirmed. Don't worry. We texted the address to your phone." Your phone. It lived in my purse, that phrase. Along with the monthly bill Sarah insisted on paying to keep things simple. It lived in the contact list Jessica had programmed for emergencies. It lived in the assumption that old hands couldn't manage new technology, that old minds couldn't navigate modern complications. I carried my tea back to the kitchen table and sat down slowly, placing the mug on the coaster I'd crocheted when Jessica was born. 28 years ago, when the future seemed full of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, not medical power of attorney forms, and what's best for everyone. "Let me understand," I said, and looked directly at my daughter. "You want me to sign papers, giving you complete control over my medical decisions. You want me to sign over my house, our family home, so you can sell it without involving me? And you want me to move to Sunset Manor by Thursday?" "That's not how we'd put it," Sarah said quickly. "It's exactly how you'd put it," I replied, not unkindly. "It's okay. If that's what you want, say it honestly." Jessica drew a breath that lifted her shoulders with theatrical precision. "We want what's best for everyone, Grandma. Boundaries. You always taught Mom to be decisive." She's being decisive. The thing about advice is that it ages differently than the person who gave it. It either becomes wisdom or it becomes a weapon. I had said those words once. Yes, in this very kitchen, when Sarah was struggling with her divorce. Decisive means choosing the right path when you're afraid of making a mistake. It had never meant choosing convenience over conscience. "All right," I said. I let the words sit unadorned, like stones dropped into still water. "All right," Sarah repeated, blinking. She hadn't expected agreement. Not yet. "I'll look everything over," I said. I don't sign things I haven't read, and I don't read when my tea is still steeping. I lifted the mug and took a slow sip. Earl Grey, familiar and warm, tasting of mornings Harold and I had shared for 5 decades. "You can leave the envelope here," I said, tapping the table. "I'll bring it to the living room when I'm ready." Jessica glanced at Sarah, who nodded, and pushed the envelope forward with 2 fingers, as if it might burn her. "We'll be upstairs," Sarah said, retreating like a deer that had heard something move in the underbrush. When they were gone, when only the refrigerator's hum and the soft tick of the mantel clock remained, I opened the envelope. I moved through pages not like a woman doing what she was told, but like a seamstress checking a pattern before cutting precious fabric. The deed transfer was on top. Beneath it, medical directives with boxes already checked. "Do not resuscitate" was mercifully blank. A third set of papers, this one surprised me. Consent forms for Sunset Manor to manage my mail, my finances, my social interactions. I didn't feel the hot anger some might expect. What I felt was clarity, sharp as the garden shears I used to prune Harold's roses. On one side of that clarity, memories, labor, a mortgage paid faithfully for 30 years, hydrangeas planted with my own hands. On the other side, efficiency, paperwork, a plan designed to move me from their problem to someone else's responsibility. There are different kinds of power. The loudest is protest. The oldest is preparation. When Harold got sick, I had learned to keep copies of everything in a safety deposit box downtown. Key number 247. When Sarah started talking about what if something happens to you, I had learned to trust paper more than promises. I closed the envelope and let my eyes rest on the photographs covering the refrigerator door. Time curved back on itself in those images. Sarah at 5, gap-toothed and proud, holding the first tomato from our garden. Harold in his work clothes, sawdust on his shoulders, teaching teenage Sarah how to build her first bookshelf. Me in my blue dress, sunlight in my hair, the day we planted the maple tree that now shaded the entire backyard. I tried to see the line between then and now, the place where love became management, where family became transaction. Maybe it had always been there, hidden beneath casseroles and birthday cards. Maybe it had appeared slowly, like the gray in my hair. So gradual I hadn't noticed until it was complete. I rose, my knee protesting quietly before settling into familiar ache. I took the envelope with me, not because they'd asked, but because I needed to feel its weight in my hands. In the hallway, I paused at the family photos lining the stairwell, my palm flat against the wall where Harold had patched a crack after the big storm in '98. The plaster felt cool, as if the house itself were taking slow, measured breaths. In my bedroom, the back bedroom with the window facing the garden I'd tended for 43 years, I sat at the small secretary desk Harold had refinished for my 50th birthday. The desk had 3 drawers. On the left, Harold's final letters from the insurance company. In the center, birth certificates and marriage licenses. The paper trail of a life lived honestly. On the right, a spiral notebook with a blue cover, the kind you buy at the 5 and dime when you need to keep track of important things. Inside the notebook, dates marched in neat columns, like soldiers standing at attention. The title on the first page read, in my careful cursive, "After Harold." I added today's date. I wrote one line, "Sarah, your memory isn't what it used to be." Then I stopped. I listened to the house settle around me, to the soft whisper of October wind through the maple leaves. Some words need time to breathe before you decide what comes next. My phone buzzed against the desk, a number I didn't recognize immediately. Then a text. "Mrs. Bennett, this is Carol from Sunset Manor. Looking forward to meeting you Tuesday. Please, bring your insurance cards and any medications." Efficient, professional, already counting me as a resident, rather than a person making a choice. I wrote Carol Sunset Manor beside today's entry and drew a small circle around it. Then I drew an arrow pointing to the word medications. People forget that medical records follow you like shadows. Once they're written, they become truth, whether they started that way or not. My fingers found the small jewelry box on the corner of the desk. Inside, Harold's wedding ring rested next to mine. I'd stopped wearing it after the arthritis made it slide off too easily. Harold's ring still carried the faint scent of the machine oil from the plant where he'd worked for 37 years. He'd given it to me the day before he died, saying, "Evelyn, love isn't something you wear. It's something you carry. But sometimes carrying gets heavy." I had not understood then what I understood now. Sometimes the thing you carry is evidence. Sometimes it's proof that you were valued, that you mattered, that your life counted for more than the sum of its inconveniences. I closed the jewelry box and opened the center drawer. Inside was a folder I kept, not out of suspicion, but out of experience. The deed to the house, with both Harold's and my name clearly printed. Tax records showing payments made promptly for 28 years. The life insurance policy that had paid off the mortgage when Harold passed. Social Security statements proving my independence. Medical records from Dr. Patterson showing no signs of dementia, confusion, or incompetence. I did not pull them out. Not tonight. I just let my eyes trace their tabs like a pianist running fingers over familiar keys. Some women fight with their voices. I had learned long ago to fight with documentation. I closed the drawer and returned to the envelope. I opened it again and read each clause slowly, marking margins where phrases drifted too close to legal quicksand. I looked for the switches hidden in the language, the places where a single word could shift ownership of a life. I had been a bookkeeper for the church for 15 years. You learn to read between lines. You learn that numbers don't lie, but people use them to tell stories that aren't quite true. Footsteps in the hallway. A soft knock. Jessica's voice, sweet as artificial sweetener. "Grandma, we can go through these together if you'd like. Sometimes it helps to have support. I'll be out in a minute," I said. "Of course," she replied, the syllables floating like dust motes in afternoon light. I stood, and, for the first time since those first words in the kitchen, I allowed myself to look in the mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back had earned her lines, her gray hair, her slower movements. She did not look helpless. She looked like a woman taking inventory. When I returned to the living room, the coffee table was set as if for a small ceremony. Envelopes centered, pens aligned, a ceramic dish of peppermints pushed to one side. Sarah sat straight-backed on the sofa, hands folded in the posture of someone prepared to be reasonable. Jessica had a legal pad open to a fresh page, with next steps written at the top in her careful print. "Shall we begin?" Jessica asked brightly. I pulled out my favorite chair, Harold's old recliner with the worn arms, where his hands had rested every evening, and sat down. I placed my tea mug on the side table next to a photograph of Harold and me on our wedding day, and folded my hands in my lap. "Let's read together," I said, line by line. It took 20 minutes to find the first loose thread. "This section," I said, tapping the page, "gives medical power of attorney to both of you, jointly and severally." Jessica brightened, recognizing a phrase from whatever research she'd done. "It just means we can both help you if one of us is busy." "It means," I said calmly, "either of you can act without consulting the other, or me." She blinked. The pen in her hand stopped its confident tapping. Sarah swallowed visibly. "Why is that a problem?" she asked. "It isn't, if you trust the people with power to stay united," I said, my voice gentle as morning mist. "But families have seasons. People get tired. People disagree. This clause makes conflict more likely, not less." "Are you saying you don't trust us?" Jessica asked, her voice climbing slightly. I looked at her steadily. "I'm saying trust grows best when it's not tested unnecessarily. A lesson Harold taught me when Sarah was 16 and asking for her first car. Give people only the power they need, not all the power they want." We continued. Another clause about mail forwarding, another about automatic payment of assisted living fees from designated accounts. That phrase made my mouth go dry because designated didn't mean mine. It meant whatever account they chose to label as such. "Carol is here," Sarah announced suddenly, checking her phone. "She's early." "Bring her in," I said, pleasant as Sunday dinner. "The more witnesses, the better, Grandma," Jessica murmured, a warning wrapped in silk. I smiled back. "Witnesses," I repeated, "not signatures." Carol from Sunset Manor smelled faintly of lavender and carried a leather portfolio that spoke of efficiency over warmth. She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and a practiced smile that she'd perfected over hundreds of similar meetings. "Good afternoon," she said cheerfully. "You must be Mrs. Bennett. I'm so pleased to meet you." "The pleasure is mine," I said, meaning it. In her line of work, she probably met many families in crisis. This wouldn't be her first complicated conversation. She opened her portfolio and set out forms, brochures, a calculator. "Now," she said, settling into the chair Jessica offered, "I understand you're interested in our independent living apartments. They're wonderful, fully equipped kitchenettes, beautiful views of our gardens, and such an active community." Jessica started to speak. I lifted my hand slightly, the kind of small gesture that carries more weight than volume. "Before we discuss apartments," I said, "we should read the paperwork my family has prepared. I believe in understanding exactly what I'm agreeing to." Carol nodded approvingly. "Absolutely. I always encourage families to take their time." We read again, out loud this time. The room changed when words left the page and entered the air. They gained weight, substance, consequence. Spoken promises echo differently than silent ones. Carol's professional smile began to fade as we reached the section about financial control. When we reached the deed transfer, Sarah cleared her throat. "Mom, this is really just a formality. I won't be signing this today," I said quietly. Jessica's head snapped up. "Why not?" "Because," I said, my voice steady as the tick of Harold's mantel clock, "you scheduled this meeting before we finished our conversation, because you chose my living situation without asking my preferences. Because you've talked about me in the past tense while I'm still very much present, and because I tap the margin of the D transfer, meaning isn't something you can reassign with paperwork. Carol's eyes moved between faces, with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to recognize family dynamics. She cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we could reschedule. Take some time to discuss things as a family? Jessica pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is exactly the kind of confusion we were talking about. It's not confusion, I said. Not unkindly. It's a boundary. Those lines families draw. Remember? Sarah reached for the papers, her hands trembling slightly. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, I replied, clear enough to know the difference between care and control, clear enough to know when I'm being managed instead of loved. Carol gathered her materials quietly, her movements practiced and professional. Mrs. Bennett, you're welcome to tour Sunset Manor anytime you'd like. No pressure, no obligations. Sometimes seeing the facility helps with decision-making. After Carol left, the house felt larger and smaller simultaneously. Sarah sat staring at the unsigned papers as if they had personally betrayed her. Jessica paced to the window, her arms crossed, her reflection sharp against the afternoon light filtering through the curtains. I don't want to fight, Sarah said finally, her voice small. I just want to know you're safe. You keep me safe by asking, not assuming, I said gently. You keep me safe by remembering that I raised you to be strong, not to make me weak. You keep me safe by loving me enough to let me choose. We sat there for a long moment, 3 generations of women in a living room that had held 50 years of conversations. Sarah's hands were shaking. Hands that had learned to comfort patients, to hold her baby daughter, to write careful reports that ensured people received proper care. Good hands. Hands that had forgotten how to ask before they acted. Okay, she whispered finally. We'll wait. Good, I said. Waiting is what adults do. Jessica remained by the window, but her shoulders had softened slightly. The anger was still there, but underneath it, I could see the little girl who used to help me plant marigolds, who used to sit on Harold's lap while he read the funny papers aloud. That evening, after they had gone home to digest what hadn't gone according to plan, I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea and the unsigned papers spread before me. I opened my blue notebook and wrote, Today, they learned that scheduled erasure requires willing participation. The house stands. The garden waits. And I remain. Outside, Mrs. Patterson's sprinkler system activated with its familiar whisper-tick rhythm, watering the roses that grew along our shared fence. The sound was companionable, like the breathing of an old friend. Harold used to say that gardens taught patience better than any sermon. You plant, you tend, you wait, and eventually you harvest. I closed the notebook, folded the unsigned papers, and slipped them back into their envelope. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new understandings, perhaps new respect for the woman they had underestimated. Tonight, I chose to sit in my kitchen, in my house, surrounded by the memories I had cultivated and the independence I was not yet ready to surrender. The night after they tried to schedule my disappearance, I didn't sleep well. I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling into itself, the soft whisper of heat through old vents, the gentle tick of Harold's mantel clock counting moments I was grateful still belonged to me. Every sound felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was still here, still deciding, still choosing what came next. In the morning, I rose before sunrise, as I always had, dressed carefully in Harold's favorite blue dress, the one he said made my eyes look like September sky, and sat at my kitchen table with coffee and purpose. The unsigned papers from yesterday lay in their envelope beside yesterday's newspaper, both untouched, both waiting. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I was planning. When Sarah arrived, she had let herself in with the key I'd given her years ago, back when keys meant trust instead of access. Her face was drawn tight with something between determination and dread. She moved carefully, the way nurses move around patients they're not sure will cooperate. "Morning, Mom," she said, pouring herself coffee from the pot I'd made. "How did you sleep?" "Like someone who still gets to choose her own bedtime," I replied gently. She winced, but sat down across from me. We drank our coffee in silence until she cleared her throat and tried again. "Mom, about yesterday. We just want you to be safe. The house is getting too much for you to manage alone." I looked at her over the rim of my mug. "According to whom?" She gestured vaguely toward the back door, where my small vegetable garden was visible through the glass. "The neighbors mentioned you've been working in the garden even when it's too hot." Mrs. Patterson was concerned. "Mrs. Patterson." I thought of our conversations over the back fence, her compliments on my tomatoes, her requests for my herb garden advice. What exactly did Mrs. Patterson say? Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "She said she worried about you overexerting yourself." I stood slowly, walked to the back door, and looked out at the neat rows of vegetables I'd planted, tended, and harvested without anyone's help. The late tomatoes were still heavy on their vines. The herbs I'd planted in Harold's memory were thriving. "Sarah," I said, still looking at the garden, "would you like to come outside with me?" We walked to the back fence where Mrs. Patterson was already working in her flower bed. She looked up when she heard our footsteps and waved cheerfully. "Good morning, Evelyn. Your tomatoes are looking beautiful." "Thank you, Helen. Sarah here tells me you're concerned about me working out here in the heat." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows drew together in confusion. "Concerned? I don't. What do you mean?" Sarah's face began to color. I thought you mentioned... "I mentioned that I was impressed with how well Evelyn maintains her garden," Mrs. Patterson said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "I said I wish I had half her energy." She looked from Sarah to me and back again. "Is everything all right?" I smiled at my neighbor of 15 years. "Everything is fine, Helen. Just a misunderstanding." As we walked back to the house, Sarah was quiet. Inside, she sat heavily at the kitchen table and stared at her coffee cup. "I didn't mean to," she began, then stopped. "What didn't you mean to do?" I asked, sitting back down across from her. "I didn't mean to lie," she whispered. I'm scared, Mom. You're all I have left, and I can't bear the thought of something happening to you when you're all alone." The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we could cross. Fear, I realized, could make people as dangerous as cruelty. "Sarah," I said gently, "who told you I was all alone?" She looked up, confused. You are alone." "It's just you in this big house." I walked to the refrigerator and pointed to the collection of phone numbers magnetized to its door. "Dr. Patterson's office, in case I need medical attention. Helen Patterson next door, who checks on me twice a week. The church, where I volunteer every Tuesday. The library, where I help with the reading program. The grocery delivery service that brings my heavy items." Sarah stared at the numbers as if seeing them for the first time. "I didn't know about most of these, because you never asked," I said, not unkindly. "You assumed. There's a difference." We talked for 2 hours that morning. Really talked. Not the careful dance of daughter-managing mother that had characterized our recent conversations. Sarah told me about her fears, her sleepless nights worrying about me, her conversations with Jessica about what if something happens. I told her about my life, the real one, not the diminished version she had imagined. "I didn't know you were still so active," she said finally. "I thought you were just sitting here, waiting." "Waiting for what?" "I don't know. For something bad to happen. For us to rescue you." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "Sarah, I'm not waiting to be rescued. I'm living. There's a difference." When Jessica arrived that afternoon, summoned, I suspected, by a phone call from her mother, she found us in the living room, looking through photo albums. Sarah had asked to see pictures of her childhood in this house, and I had been happy to oblige. Jessica paused in the doorway, clearly expecting to find us locked in the same battle as yesterday. "How was school?" I asked Jessica, just as I had when she was little and would visit after classes. She blinked, thrown off balance by the normalcy of the question. "It was fine. How are you, Grandma?" "I'm well, thank you. Your mother and I have been having a good conversation." Jessica looked at Sarah suspiciously. "About the arrangement?" "About assumptions," Sarah replied. "About the difference between being alone and being independent. About the difference between helping and controlling." Jessica sat down slowly in Harold's old chair, the same one I had claimed yesterday during our paper signing standoff. "I don't understand," she said. Sarah explained what we had discovered about my support system, my activities, my actual capabilities, versus her imagined limitations. As she talked, Jessica's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been embarrassment. "But Grandma," Jessica said finally, "you have to admit you're not as young as you used to be. Things could happen." "Things could happen to any of us," I replied. "You could have a car accident driving to work. Your mother could have a heart attack at the hospital. I could fall in my garden. The difference is, I've prepared for possibilities without surrendering to them." I walked to Harold's old desk in the corner of the living room and returned with a folder I hadn't shown them before. "Medical directives," I said, opening it. "Completed 6 months ago with Dr. Patterson's help. Emergency contact information for you both, but also for Helen, Pastor Williams, and my cousin Ruth in Indianapolis. A will that's been updated and notarized. Insurance information organized by importance. Account numbers, passwords, and instructions for how to handle my affairs if I become unable to do so myself." Both women stared at the neat organization of my preparations. "You've been planning?" Sarah said slowly. "I've been living responsibly," I corrected. "The way you taught me to. The way Harold and I taught you to." Jessica leaned forward. "Why didn't you show us this before?" "Because you never asked about my plans," I said. "You made your own plans for me." The room was quiet except for the familiar sounds of the house around us. The gentle hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of Harold's clock, the whisper of October whined through the maple leaves outside. "I feel like an idiot," Jessica said finally, her voice small. "You feel like someone who made assumptions," I replied. "We all do that sometimes. The question is what we do when we realize we were wrong." Sarah was still staring at the folder in front of her. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I thought you were fading away. I thought you needed us to take over." "I do need you," I said gently. "Just not the way you imagined. I need you to be my daughter, not my manager. I need you to visit because you want to, not because you feel obligated to check on the old lady. I need you to ask about my life, not assume you already know it." We spent the rest of that afternoon talking about what support actually looked like. Not Sunset Manor, not deed transfers, not medical power of attorney signed in haste. Support looked like phone calls that asked about my day instead of my symptoms. It looked like invitations to family dinners instead of interventions. It looked like respect for the choices I could still make, and honest conversations about the choices I might need help with someday. "What if something does happen?" Jessica asked. "What if you fall and we're not here?" I showed her the medical alert system. Dr. 4. Patterson had recommended, the one I'd had installed 3 months earlier. I showed her the list of daily check-ins I'd arranged with Helen and the church volunteers. I showed her the meal delivery service I'd researched for winter months, when driving became more difficult. "You've thought of everything," Sarah marveled. "I've thought of the things I could think of," I corrected. "But I can't think of everything, and neither can you. That's why we have to trust each other to ask for help when we need it, instead of imposing help when we don't. That evening, after Sarah and Jessica had gone home with promises to call more often and visit more naturally, I sat in Harold's recliner with my blue notebook open in my lap. I wrote, "Today my daughter learned the difference between rescue and respect. Today my granddaughter learned that assumptions are the enemy of understanding. Today we began to rebuild what fear had nearly torn down." But the story didn't end there. 3 days later, Jessica called with an idea. "Grandma, would you be interested in having Thanksgiving here this year?" Mom and I were talking, and we thought it would be nice to have dinner in the house where Mom grew up. "If you don't mind the work." I smiled, looking around my kitchen that hadn't hosted Thanksgiving in 5 years. Not since they'd decided it was too much for me. "I'd love that," I said, "but I'll need help with the heavy lifting. These old bones aren't what they used to be." "Of course," Jessica said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "We'll bring everything we can. You just worry about, whatever you want to worry about. It's your house." The morning of Thanksgiving, I woke before dawn and stood at my kitchen window watching the sun paint the maple tree golden. The house felt alive around me, anticipating the voices and laughter it had missed. Sarah arrived first, carrying grocery bags and wearing an apron I remembered from her childhood. The one with tiny strawberries that I'd sewn for her when she was 8, and wanted to help with everything. "Where do you want me to start?" she asked. And the question itself was a gift. Not, "Let me take over," but "Where do you want me?" Jessica came later with her own family. Her husband Mark, whom I'd barely seen in 2 years, and their 10-year-old son David, who had inherited Harold's curiosity about how things worked. As we prepared the meal together, David asked if he could see the workshop where great-grandpa Harold had built furniture. I led him to the basement, switching on lights that hadn't been used in months, running my hand along Harold's workbench where his tools still hung in neat rows. "Great-grandpa made all this?" David asked, touching the wooden toy box Harold had crafted for him as a baby. "He made lots of things," I said, "but mostly he made memories. That's what this workshop was really for, making memories with people he loved." David picked up one of Harold's smaller hammers, testing its weight. "Could you teach me to make something?" The question caught me off guard. I could try. I'm not as good as your great-grandpa was, but I watched him enough times. "Could we make something for Mom and Grandma Sarah, like a peace offering?" I looked at this boy who had somehow understood that there had been a war, and that wars needed peace offerings. "What did you have in mind? Maybe picture frames? For the photos you showed us last time?" We spent an hour in Harold's workshop, David asking questions about measurements and wood grain while I guided his small hands with Harold's tools. It felt like a conversation with the past, as if Harold were standing beside us, proud that his workshop was teaching again instead of just remembering. During dinner, we sat around the dining room table that had hosted 43 Thanksgivings before this one. The chairs were the same. Harold had built them to last, but the people in them had grown, changed, learned. Sarah asked about my volunteer work at the library. Jessica asked about my garden plans for next spring. Mark asked about Harold's workshop and whether I'd mind if he brought David back to learn more woodworking. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it. The workshop has been too quiet. After dinner, as we cleaned up together, David presented his peace offering, a small, slightly crooked picture frame he'd sanded smooth with my guidance. "It's for the picture of you and Great-Grandpa," he said solemnly, "so you can remember him while we're making new memories." That night, after everyone had gone home with leftover turkey and promises to return soon, I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook. The house felt larger somehow, as if it had stretched to accommodate all the love it had held that day. I wrote, "Today, I learned that some bridges, once burned, can be rebuilt with patience and honesty. Today, I learned that independence and interdependence aren't enemies. Today, I learned that home isn't a place you leave or a place others choose for you. It's a place where you're known, valued, and trusted to be yourself. I closed the notebook and walked through the house, turning off lights, checking locks, performing the small rituals that mark the end of one day and the hope for another. In Harold's old chair, I paused to look at David's picture frame, already holding the photo he'd chosen. Harold and me in our garden, dirt under our fingernails, pride on our faces, surrounded by the roses we'd planted together. Outside, the maple tree Harold had planted 30 years ago rustled in the November wind, its bare branches reaching toward stars I couldn't see but knew were there. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities to choose understanding over assumption. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in the house that Harold built, surrounded by the memories we'd created, holding space for the love that continued to grow. The winter after Thanksgiving, things settled into a new rhythm. Sarah called twice a week, not to check symptoms, but to share news about her patients, her garden plans, her memories of Harold. Jessica visited every Sunday, sometimes bringing David to work on projects in Harold's shop, sometimes coming alone just to sit and talk. Mark proved surprisingly gifted at woodworking and began helping me maintain the parts of the house that required strength I no longer possessed. Spring brought its own revelations. When I mentioned wanting to expand my herb garden but worrying about the heavy digging, Sarah surprised me by taking vacation days to help. We worked side by side in the dirt, her nursing uniform replaced by old jeans and one of Harold's work shirts, her hands remembering the feel of soil from childhood summers spent helping me weed and plant. "I forgot how much I loved this," she said, sitting back on her heels to survey our work. "I forgot you loved it too," I replied. "I thought all you cared about anymore was keeping me safe." She was quiet for a moment, pulling weeds with more concentration than they required. "I was scared," she said finally. "After Dad died, I was so scared of losing you too. I thought if I could control everything, keep you in a safe place, I could prevent anything bad from happening." "And what do you think now?" I asked gently. "Now I think safety isn't a place," she said. "It's knowing you have people who love you enough to let you live your own life, even when they're scared." We finished the herb garden that day, planting basil and oregano and the lavender Harold had always loved. As we worked, neighbors stopped to chat over the fence, and I realized that Sarah was seeing my life as it actually existed, not as she had imagined it. "You really aren't alone, are you?" she said as we cleaned our tools. "No," I said, "I never was. You just had to learn how to see it." That evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the sky the color of Harold's favorite roses, Sarah asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Mom, what will you do when you really can't manage alone anymore?" It was the right question, finally, asked in the right way. Not, "When are you going to admit you need help?" but, "What are your plans when circumstances change?" "I'll ask for help," I said simply, "from you. From Jessica, from the support systems I've built. And if the day comes when this house becomes too much, I'll make that choice myself, with your input, not your insistence. And if you can't make that choice anymore, if your mind," she couldn't finish the sentence, "then you'll have the legal authority to help me through the proper documents, signed when I'm of sound mind and clear judgment, but not before then, and not without my dignity intact." We sat in comfortable silence as the fireflies began their evening dance in the maple tree's shadow. "I love you, Mom," Sarah said softly. "I love you too," I replied. "Enough to let you love me the right way." As summer turned to autumn again, David started school but continued visiting on weekends to work on projects with me. His latest creation was a bird feeder designed to hang from the maple tree, crafted with Harold's tools and his own careful measurements. "Great-Grandma," he said as we hung the feeder together, "are you happy?" The question startled me with its directness. Children have a way of asking what adults dance around. "Yes," I said, realizing as I spoke that it was completely true. I'm happy. Are you? Yeah, he said, adjusting the feeder's position with serious concentration. I like that everyone talks to each other now, instead of about each other. Out of the mouths of babes. That evening I wrote in my notebook. A 10-year-old understands what took adults months to learn. Love talks to, not about. Love asks, not assumes. Love supports, not supplants. As I closed the notebook, I thought about the unsigned papers that had started this whole journey, still tucked away in their envelope, no longer a threat but a reminder of how quickly love can turn into control when fear takes the wheel. Now, as winter approaches again and the maple tree Harold planted stands bare against the December sky, I sit in his chair reading to David from the same books I once read to Sarah. The house holds us all, past and present, memory and possibility, independence and interdependence, woven together like the quilt Harold's mother made for our wedding bed. Sometimes people ask me if I was afraid during those weeks, when my future seemed to be slipping out of my hands. The answer is no. I was never afraid of being old, or alone, or even of dying someday. I was afraid of disappearing while I was still alive, of becoming a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved. But I learned something important in those difficult months. You can't disappear someone who knows her own worth. You can't erase someone who has built a life on solid foundations of relationship, preparation, and self-respect. You can't schedule the end of a story that's still being written by the person living it. The papers from Sunset Manor still arrive occasionally, cheerful brochures full of smiling seniors engaged in scheduled activities. I don't throw them away. I use them as bookmarks, reminders that someday I may indeed need more help than my house and garden can accommodate. When that day comes, if it comes, I'll make that choice with clear eyes and sound mind, surrounded by family who love me enough to support my decision rather than make it for me. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like this remind us all that dignity doesn't decrease with age, and that the best care comes not from control, but from compassion. To hear another story about family, resilience, and the power of standing your ground with grace, click on the next video in the playlist. But the real test of our rebuilt relationship came that first winter, when the snow fell heavier than it had in years and the pipes in the basement began to show their age. I woke one Tuesday morning to the sound of water dripping somewhere it shouldn't be, and when I investigated, I found a steady stream running from the utility room into the main basement area. For a moment, standing there in my robe and slippers, watching the water pool around boxes of Christmas decorations Harold had carefully labeled and stored, I felt the weight of the house's needs pressing against my capabilities. This wasn't a burned-out light bulb or a squeaky door hinge. This was the kind of emergency that required more than my aging hands could manage. I climbed the stairs slowly, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with the phone in front of me. 6 months ago, I might have called a plumber first, tried to handle it myself, not wanted to bother Sarah or Jessica. But we had made promises to each other about asking for help when it was genuinely needed. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Mom, it's early. Is everything okay?" "I have a pipe situation in the basement," I said simply. "Water where there shouldn't be water. I need help. No apologies, no minimizing, no shame. Just facts." "I'll be right over," she said immediately. "Should I call a plumber?" "That might be wise," I said. "And maybe bring some old towels from your linen closet if you have them." 30 minutes later, Sarah arrived with towels, a thermos of fresh coffee, and Jessica trailing behind with what appeared to be every bucket her household owned. They didn't sweep in taking charge, didn't push me aside, didn't treat me like an invalid who couldn't handle crisis. Instead, Sarah asked, "What do you think happened?" And Jessica asked, "Where do you keep your main water shut-off?" We worked together to contain the immediate damage, while the plumber, a young woman named Maria, who turned out to be Mrs. Patterson's niece, assessed the situation. The pipe that had burst was old, she explained, probably original to the house, weakened by decades of freeze-thaw cycles. It would need to be replaced, along with several other pipes in the same section. The good news, Maria said, wiping her hands on a rag, is that the damage is localized. The bad news is that it's going to be expensive. And you'll need to clear out that section of the basement so I can access all the pipes properly. She gave me an estimate that made my coffee cup rattle slightly against its saucer when I set it down. After Maria left, the three of us stood in my kitchen looking at the number she'd written on her business card. Sarah said carefully, "That's a lot of money." "It is," I agreed. "But the house is worth maintaining properly." Jessica shifted uncomfortably. "Grandma, maybe this is a sign that the house is getting too expensive to keep up." I looked at both of them, these women I loved who still sometimes mistook a crisis for an opportunity to revise my life. "Jessica," I said gently, "if your apartment needed a major repair, would you automatically assume you needed to move, or would you figure out how to afford the repair?" She had the grace to look embarrassed. "I'd figure out how to afford it." "This is my home," I continued. "It's where your mother learned to walk, where you learned to bake cookies, where Harold and I built a life together. One expensive repair doesn't erase 43 years of equity and meaning." Sarah nodded slowly. "You're right. So, what do you need from us?" That question, "What do you need from us?" was the right one, finally. We spent the next hour making practical plans. Sarah would help me clear the basement section that needed access. Jessica would research contractors to get a second estimate. I would call my insurance company to see what might be covered, and check with the bank about financing options if needed. But most importantly, we would make these decisions together, with my needs and preferences at the center, not pushed to the margins. Over the following weeks, as the pipe repair project unfolded, I learned things about my daughter and granddaughter that I hadn't known. Sarah, it turned out, was surprisingly handy with basic electrical work, a skill she'd learned during her nursing training but never mentioned. Jessica had an eye for organizing storage spaces and an unexpected talent for negotiating with contractors. The basement project became something of a family archaeology expedition. In boxes we hadn't opened in years, we found Sarah's high school yearbooks, Jessica's baby shoes, Harold's collection of woodworking magazines, and photo albums documenting holidays and milestones I'd forgotten we'd captured. "Look at this," Jessica said, holding up a picture of me in my 40s, covered in flour, laughing at something outside the camera's view. "You look so happy." "I was happy," I said, taking the photo. "I still am, just differently." She studied my face in the picture, then looked at me now. "I think I always imagined that getting old meant being less happy, like happiness was something that decreased over time. Happiness changes," I said. "When you're young, it's often about what might happen. When you're my age, it's often about what did happen and being grateful for it." As spring arrived and the pipe repairs were completed, the basement had been transformed from a catch-all storage space into an organized area that Harold would have approved of. His workshop was more accessible, his tools properly stored, his workbench cleared and ready for David's next visit. "It looks good down there," Sarah said, surveying our work. "Better than it has in years." "Sometimes disruption leads to improvement," I replied. "Even when you don't choose the timing." She understood I wasn't just talking about plumbing. That spring brought other changes too. Jessica announced she was pregnant again, a surprise that sent ripples of joy through our small family. "I want to raise this baby the way you raised me, Grandma," she said, her hand on her still flat stomach. "With roots, with family stories, with a great-grandmother who teaches patience and strength." I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. This new baby would grow up knowing me not as a burden or a problem to be managed, but as a person with stories to tell and love to give. "Have you thought about names?" I asked. "If it's a girl," Jessica said softly. "We were thinking about Ruth, after great-grandma." Harold's Ruth, my beloved friend and partner, the woman who had taught me that love sometimes meant letting go, and sometimes meant holding on, and wisdom was knowing the difference. She would have been honored, I said, and meant it. As summer deepened and Jessica's pregnancy progressed, she began spending more time at my house, not because she needed to check on me, but because she wanted to learn the family recipes she'd never asked about before, the stories behind the photographs that lined my hallways, the names of the neighbors who had become my chosen family. "Tell me about when Mom was little," she'd say, settling into Harold's chair with a glass of iced tea. "Tell me about the first time you planted the garden. Tell me about Grandpa Harold's workshop." And I would tell her these stories I'd thought no one wanted to hear, memories I'd assumed were only precious to me. "I wish I'd asked these questions years ago," she said one afternoon. "I wish I'd known you better before I thought I needed to take care of you." "You can't know what you haven't experienced," I replied. "But you can learn when you're ready to listen." We were sitting on the back porch, watching David and his father Mark work on a new project in Harold's workshop. Through the basement windows, we could see the measuring boards, their heads bent together in concentration. "It's funny," Jessica said. "I used to think this house was too big for you. Too much work. Too much responsibility. Now I think maybe it's just the right size for holding all the love it contains." That autumn, as the maple tree shed its leaves in preparation for another winter, I realized I'd been keeping a different kind of notebook in my head, not recording grievances and strategies, but gratitude and growth. The entries might have read, "Today, Jessica asked about Harold's favorite music. Today, Sarah helped me reorganize the linen closet, without suggesting I donate half of it. Today, David built a small shelf for my herb drying, measuring twice and cutting once, just like his great-grandfather taught him." When Jessica's daughter, Ruth Eleanor, they named her, was born that November, I held her in the same rocking chair where I'd held Jessica 28 years earlier. She was tiny, perfect, and completely unaware that she was the newest chapter in a story that had almost ended too soon. "She looks like you, Grandma," Jessica whispered, exhausted but radiant, around the eyes. "She looks like herself," I corrected gently. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone can look like." As I rocked this new great-granddaughter, I thought about the papers that had started our family's difficult journey, the unsigned documents that had tried to transfer not just property ownership, but the ownership of my story. They were still filed away somewhere, a reminder of how quickly love can become control when fear is driving. But holding Ruth Eleanor, watching her tiny fingers curl around my thumb with surprising strength, I realized that the most important transfers of ownership aren't recorded on legal documents. They happen in rocking chairs and workshops, in gardens and kitchens, in the patient sharing of recipes and stories and values. They happen when one generation trusts the next enough to let them choose their own path, and when the next generation loves the previous one enough to honor where they came from. "What are you thinking about?" Jessica asked softly. "Continuity," I said. "How love passes from one person to the next, one generation to the next, one story to the next. How it changes but doesn't diminish." The baby made a soft sound, content in the crook of my arm. "She'll grow up knowing she's part of something larger than herself," I continued. "A family with deep roots and strong branches." That winter, my second winter since the family intervention that wasn't, brought its own challenges. The pipes held, but the furnace began showing its age, making sounds that Harold would have diagnosed as expensive. I called Sarah immediately, no longer hesitant to ask for help with genuinely necessary matters. "Another repair project?" she asked, but her tone was understanding rather than frustrated. "Another opportunity to improve something that served us well," I replied. This time, the solution was more complex. The furnace could be repaired, but it was old enough that replacement might be more cost-effective long-term. Sarah and Jessica came over with their husbands, and we all sat around my kitchen table with estimates from 3 different heating contractors, comparing options like the family board of directors we'd become. The new high-efficiency model would cut your heating bills significantly, Mark observed, studying the numbers. The payback period is about 7 years, Jessica added. That assumes you'll be here for 7 years, Sarah said quietly, then caught herself. I mean, that's the financial calculation. Obviously, you'll be here as long as you want to be. I looked around the table at these 4 adults who had learned, sometimes painfully, to include me in decisions about my own life. I plan to be here for as many years as I'm given, I said. And when I'm not, this house will pass to people who will appreciate that it's been well maintained. They nodded, and we chose the high-efficiency furnace. As another spring arrived, and the garden called to me again, I realized that the rhythm of seasons had taught me something about aging that I couldn't have learned any other way. Each season brings its own challenges, its own beauty, its own necessary work. Spring requires planting and hope. Summer requires tending and patience. Autumn requires harvesting and gratitude. Winter requires rest and reflection. I had thought for a while that my life was stuck in autumn, dealing with loss, managing decline, preparing for endings. But I'd been wrong. I was in a different season entirely, one I'd never experienced before. A season that required sharing wisdom, building bridges, creating space for new growth, while honoring what had come before. "Grandma Great," David announced one Saturday morning, using the name he'd invented for me when Ruth Eleanor arrived, and great-grandma became confusing. "I have an idea for the workshop." He was 7 now, tall enough to reach Harold's lower tool shelves, confident enough to propose projects instead of just following instructions. "What's your idea?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I want to build a cradle for baby Ruth, like the one great-grandpa Harold made for Mom when she was little." He pointed to the corner of my bedroom where the cradle still sat, now holding quilts my mother had made decades ago. "Do you think he would have taught me if he was still here?" The question pierced my heart in the gentlest way. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "He would have been so proud to teach you. He always said the best gift you can give someone is to teach them to make something beautiful with their own hands. Then will you help me? You watched him enough times." So we began. Every weekend, David would arrive with his father, and we would work in Harold's shop, measuring and cutting and sanding, my hands guiding his as Harold's had once guided mine. It was slow work. David's attention span required frequent breaks for snacks and stories, and my arthritis required frequent breaks for rest and stretching. But it was also sacred work. In teaching David to use Harold's tools, to read Harold's carefully preserved patterns, to understand Harold's philosophy of measure twice, cut once, I was passing along more than woodworking skills. I was transferring the essence of a man who had believed in creating beauty, solving problems with patience, and building things to last. "Why did great-grandpa Harold keep so many different kinds of sandpaper?" David asked one afternoon, examining Harold's organized collection of grits and grades. "Because different stages of work require different tools," I explained. "When you're starting, you need the rough sandpaper to take away the big imperfections. As you get closer to finished, you need finer and finer grades to make everything smooth." He nodded seriously, then looked up at me with Harold's eyes, the same blue-gray that saw possibilities in raw wood, potential in problems. "Is that like people too? Like families need different kinds of help at different times? The wisdom of children?" "Yes," I said, "exactly like that." By the time the cradle was finished, in late summer, when Ruth Eleanor was old enough to appreciate the gentle rocking motion David had carefully calibrated, it was clear that the project had been about much more than furniture. David had gained confidence, skill, and a connection to his great-grandfather's legacy. I had rediscovered the joy of teaching, of watching young hands learn to create something beautiful. More importantly, the entire family had witnessed something that would have been impossible during those difficult months when they'd tried to manage my life for me. They'd seen that age doesn't automatically eliminate capability, that wisdom can be transferred across generations, that the elderly aren't just recipients of care but contributors to family heritage. "It's perfect," Jessica whispered, settling baby Ruth into the cradle for the first time. "She fits just right." The baby looked up at us with serious eyes, as if understanding that she was experiencing something important, a connection to people she would never meet, but whose love had shaped the hands that built her bed. That evening, as the family gathered on my back porch to watch the sunset paint the sky above Harold's maple tree, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from completing meaningful work. Sarah was holding Ruth Eleanor, while David demonstrated the cradle's gentle rocking mechanism to his parents. Jessica was discussing plans for the garden next spring, asking my advice about which vegetables grew best in partial shade. "Mom," Sarah said softly, settling beside me on the porch swing Harold had built for our 20th anniversary, "I owe you an apology I've never properly given." "For what?" I asked, though I knew. "For assuming that getting older meant getting less capable. For thinking that needing help meant needing management. For trying to solve problems you hadn't asked me to solve." I took her hand, still the same hand that had helped me plant marigolds when she was 5, that had gripped mine during Harold's funeral, that now cared for patience with the gentleness I'd tried to teach her. "We were both learning," I said. "You were learning how to be a daughter to an aging mother. I was learning how to be a mother who accepts help without surrendering autonomy." "Are we better at it now?" she asked. I looked around the porch at this family that had nearly fractured, but had instead grown stronger, more honest, more capable of loving each other through difficulty. "We're better at asking the right questions," I said, "and that makes all the difference." As autumn deepened and Ruth Eleanor grew from a tiny bundle into a baby with opinions and preferences, I began to understand something new about legacy. I'd always thought legacy was something you left behind after you died. Property, possessions, perhaps a few cherished memories in other people's hearts. But watching David teach his baby sister how to clap her hands, seeing Sarah approach her patients with the patience I'd tried to model, observing Jessica make decisions based on long-term value rather than short-term convenience, I realized that legacy was something you created while you lived. Every day that I chose dignity over self-pity, collaboration over control, grace over grievance, I was shaping the example my family would carry forward. Every time I asked for help when I needed it and declined help when I didn't, I was teaching them the difference between support and usurpation. Every moment I spent sharing stories, skills, and values, I was ensuring that the best parts of Harold and me would continue in new forms. The winter of Ruth Eleanor's first year was gentler than the previous one, partly because the new furnace worked beautifully, but mostly because our family had learned to weather storms together rather than despite each other. When I slipped on the ice outside the post office and sprained my wrist, Sarah came to help without taking over. When the old washing machine finally gave up after 28 years of faithful service, Jessica helped me research replacements without assuming I couldn't handle the decision. Most tellingly, when David asked if he could bring a friend to the workshop to show him Great-Grandpa Harold's tools, they didn't hesitate to trust my judgment about safety and supervision. "Just remember," Sarah said, "Harold always said the most important rule in any workshop is that everyone goes home with the same number of fingers they came with." Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Ruth Eleanor took her first steps in my kitchen, holding onto the same chair legs that had supported Sarah's first steps 45 years earlier. David finished second grade and announced that he wanted to build a bookshelf for his new baby sister when she was old enough for books. Jessica was pregnant again, the last one, she promised, though her smile suggested she'd said that before. And I celebrated my 80th birthday, surrounded by 4 generations of family in the house Harold and I had built together. eating cake from plates that had served countless celebrations, laughing at stories that grew funnier with each telling. "Make a wish, Grandma Great," David instructed, as I prepared to blow out the candles. I looked around the table at these faces I loved, thought about the journey we'd traveled from crisis to understanding, from fear to trust, from managing to loving. My wish was simple, that we would continue to grow together, to learn from each other, to face whatever came next with the same courage and grace we'd discovered in each other over these past years. As I blew out the candles, I realized that the story that had begun with words designed to erase me, "Your memory isn't what it used to be," had evolved into something entirely different. A story about resilience, about the power of standing your ground with grace, about the difference between growing old and growing irrelevant. My memory, it turned out, was exactly what it needed to be: sharp enough to remember lessons learned, gentle enough to forgive mistakes made, wide enough to hold decades of love, and generous enough to create space for new memories still being made. And that, I thought as my family sang happy birthday in voices that blended like a familiar harmony, was the most beautiful inheritance any woman could hope to leave behind.